Hi everyone, my name is Bongwe Mpungwase, and today I'll be interviewing Brandon Zietsman, who's the CEO of PortfolioMetrix. So Brandon, thank you for making the time today. You are the CEO and the Chief Investment Officer of PortfolioMetrix, which is a global investment management firm. And 3 years ago, you then embarked on a journey to study your Masters of Science in Global Challenges through Edinburgh University. Which is now nearing completion. Congratulations on that. I'm much more interested in knowing and understanding what possessed you to make such a dramatic departure from your familiar area of expertise.
I think, Bongs, it depends on who you ask. So I think if you ask my wife, she'd say impulse. But look, these are all topics that I've had a deep interest in for most of my life, and obviously as we progress through time, they become more topical, and particularly some that relate to the risks that overhang humanity on the planet. But also, I think from a professional point of view, investments are forward-looking, right? So when markets sort of collapse and billions are wiped off, and everyone says, well, where did the billions actually go? They didn't go anywhere. It's just that our assessment of the future changed. The assessment that certain things would happen, or the likelihood that they would happen, changed. So ultimately, economies and linked to that markets are relate to how humans thrive or don't thrive, whether the societies that they operate in are stable or unstable, what they produce, is it sustainable? So these things all lie out in the future, and fundamentally, are going to end up in your pension fund.
Yes.
So I think that it is very, very hard. The further we look out in the future, the harder it is to predict. And that's one of the reasons why analysts tend to look a little bit short term and get surprised by things like a global pandemic, where all the writing was on the wall, but we got a recency bias. We just haven't seen anything like that in our experience. The evidence was abundant that we were on the brink of a war in Europe with a nuclear armed power, yet the analyst community kind of failed to fully assign the right weight. So I think that just understanding these risks and kind of recognizing them when we see them has some professional application.
Yeah, true. The sheer breadth of global challenges, right, seems to be overwhelming for most people. And we read about the risk posed by, for instance, climate change, the loss of rainforests and species and all of that stuff. And we have stuck inequalities when it comes to just different nations even, looking at great power rivalry, which captures headlines on a daily. Also the rise of populism, right? Now we have existential risk, which stems from artificial intelligence. How does humankind even begin to tackle such differentiated challenges? And is this even possible?
I think, often the question is, are you optimistic or pessimistic? And I think that the first thing there is that those are subjective perceptions. You're most going to be best served by realism. In other words, a balanced perspective of things. But I do think that there is an element of whether you tackle things with a positive attitude or a defeatist attitude. So I like to think that the problems we face are solvable. I think that there are significant risks if we don't solve them.
You always say that.
Yeah, but look, I think the thing with complex problems, and we're dealing with massively complex problems, is they will benefit from simplification. And one of the things in investments that we obviously do is our stock and trade is risk. And the extent to which we can simplify problems, break them down to common factors, etc., gives us a deeper understanding. So, for example, there are what we would call systematic risks. They're things that happen in the world that will drive everything, and you see the entire stock market rise and fall. And then we'd often talk about idiosyncratic risks. Now, that might be the reason why one bank fails and one bank succeeds and what have you. And when we build portfolios, we don't have crystal balls, but what we can do is if we can characterize those risks, we can kind of inoculate portfolios to certain types of influences. And I really believe that when you look at global challenges, there's such a multiplicity of them, there's such a plethora of them, that to look at them all disparately means you've got almost this overwhelming problem to solve. But if there's a common thread, or common threads, or common roots, or in financial parlance, systematic risks, it allows us to actually simplify the problem and potentially deal with them more effectively and create a multiplication effect.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
It does, it really does. I'm talking about common factors, right? I guess there may be a number of examples of common factors that drive or influence many of the challenges that we currently face. Do you mind just like picking just one and elaborating more on that one?
Well, the one that I like thinking about and talking about is actually our humanness, funny enough. The common thing to every single challenge we face in the world is we've got human beings involved. Now, if there's a common factor in terms of how we perceive risk, and our perceptions then obviously inform our responses, and if there's some systematic bias or some miscalibration there, then we're probably going to systematically respond in a suboptimal way. So, look, we're the product of countless millennia of evolution. So, and I'm not just talking about the 300,000 years that modern humans have been around, or the 3 million years that the genus Homo has been around, but even going back way before that, way before we even became humans. And we developed instincts, and evolution kind of favored the survival of those people who navigated the threat environment best or took advantage of opportunities. But if you think about how different the risk landscape is that we face now relative to the overwhelming period of our evolution, right? Is there a possibility that we haven't actually developed our risk responses correctly? So, I mean,
Interesting point.
Yeah, so we kind of, if you think about like things that growl at you, or sort of spears rattling on on shields, these are risks that were proximal in time and space. So they're actually physically close to you, they're nearby, they're tangible threats. And you think about what we face now in a world where you've got the ability to destroy yourself. We've had nuclear weapons and enough of them since the 1950s to literally wipe ourselves and everything else out. We're in an era now that has been proposed that we call the Anthropocene, and where what that kind of means is that we're in almost like an epoch where human beings are now the dominant drivers of geological and biological processes on the planet. Now this is unprecedented. So you're dealing with risks that are more abstract, less tangible. They're distant, they're distal, right? They affect other people and not me directly. And as a result of that, it may be that we are assigning too much emphasis to a certain type of risk that may not deserve the weight it gets. And by the same token, we could be underappreciating risks that are very, very significant just because they don't fit our natural perception of what our primal response to risk.
Absolutely. Brandon, right? Understanding and navigating risk is stock and trade for investment managers. And you touched on that a bit earlier on, but many still get it wrong. I'm intrigued as to what parallels have you perhaps drawn in the world of investing, and your previous remarks about how we perceive risks. Are there any?
Yeah, so I mean, investment management, funny enough, is a profession because airline pilots are expected to land the plane every time, and if you're an engineer and you build the bridge, it's kind of meant to last. Okay, more than half of investment managers get it wrong. And a lot of that has to do with just pure maths. You can't all get it right, okay? You can't all get it right at the same time. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that investment managers are human beings, like everyone else.
And we forget about that sometimes.
Yeah, and we're subjected to exactly the same sort of evolutionary biases. And I mean, they're all over the place. So you can see them in investment management, but you can very readily extend this to the behavior of politicians, policymakers, people running any kind of program. We suffer from overconfidence biases. So you have massively complex worlds where we tend to have a fairly simplistic interpretation of it and tend to produce linear arguments for massively non-linear problems. You're going to take a situation where you've got, for your thesis to be correct on an investment, or you may have a program or an intervention. But for that sort of theory of change to actually hold true, it may be that there are 4 assumptions that need to be true. If any one of those 4 assumptions is fundamentally wrong, then the likelihood of it not working is high. But let's pretend on each one of 4 independent assumptions you make that there's a 70% chance of being right. Okay, now 70 is pretty good. Hey? I mean, you're guessing, crystal ball gazing, 70 is good. But for all 70 to be correct, for all 4 to be correct, you've got a less than 25% chance of them all being correct, and the whole thing becomes noise very, very quickly. Yeah. And we see this. We see recency bias. We see the giving an unreasonable weight to things that happened in the near past, and actually potentially dismissing or not giving enough emphasis to things that happened a little bit further back. But it may be entirely possible those things are just as significant to the data set. There are many more. I mean, we have herd behavior, and that is very, very clear. You can see people observing their peers and kind of assigning, again, a very high prominence to the wisdom of the collective, actually sometimes in defiance of the data. But the one that actually sort of probably worries me most is a phenomenon called loss aversion. And this is so easy to prove empirically. You can run some very, very simple tests. There was Tversky and Kahneman, I think, back in the day, put together a prospect theory was what they came up with. And what they were showing was that our aversion to losses, how much we hate losing, is roughly twice as much as we like winning. Now you can kind of say, well, okay, that's not, how bad is that? That's just a risk preference, right? That's my personality. Actually, it's far more complex than that because it challenges the foundations of our rationality. And you can prove very, very quickly that possessing such a behavioral bias leads to consistently suboptimal outcomes over time. Now, how does this relate to the real world that we live in? We can see in every sphere of human behavior how we will avoid short-term pain or losses or defer it. Now, that could be social losses. It could be anything. But we have a preference for shorter-term gratification and delaying pain. And this comes down to sort of how we allocate funding for projects. If there's a proximal need and there's proximal pain and these are voters and you get voted in every 4 years versus things that you need to solve over multiple decades, we systematically avoid the short-term pain and to a large degree disregard the long-term picture. So yes, it's an analogy in investments and it's almost a petri dish. You can make it a little, it's a little microcosm. But I see that little microcosm extrapolating into all areas of human endeavor, and particularly in policy making and how we assign weights to risks. And obviously our response to those risks.
Good one. I want us to touch on organizational dynamics. Clearly tackling global challenges, right, is going to require immense organization, but also which is going to involve multiple stakeholders and complex organizational choices. You've spent over half of your career in big corporates before founding PortfolioMetrix in 2013, and you've been both inside large corporates, so you have that experience, and then competed with them with fewer resources. What parallels can you draw between business organizations that thrive or fail, number one, and large multilateral organizations and the success and failure of their programs?
Okay, so I think, if I had to return to the theme that we started off, is that we're a product of our evolution, and I think that my first observations were individual, right, and then how we as individuals have evolved and perceived things, and we extended that to a number of examples of behavioral biases in investing. But equally, we've evolved as groups because we are social animals. So we operate collectively in terms of how we compete and cooperate, and how groups cooperate inside and how they compete with other groups. Now, obviously, you go far back enough in our sort of time frame. You're competing for food resources that exist, in the wild, and at some point you're competing for space and land, and there's rivalry and war and all of these things. But the general principles of having objectives that you're trying to solve for within a set of constraints, operating with given resources and collectively, and you're competing, right, are fundamentally similar. But what has changed in a way is the complexity of those environments and our ability to comprehend that complexity. Because our innate instinct is to simplify. But if the environment is complex enough, you risk going from simple to simplistic, right, which then becomes problematic. So obviously there are big organizations that have thrived, and there are many big organizations that fail, and then plenty that stagnate. And right, stagnating is not a stable equilibrium. You're either going to fail or fix or something. Now, we've obviously, we built a business that we started 13 years ago, and we've successfully broke into a very mature industry with incumbents that looked massively hard to displace. But there's always flux somewhere, and I think this is a product of the modern world, is that rate of flux is very, very high at the moment. Now, what I have observed, I mean, so how do we break in? You've got organizations with massively more resources than you.
True.
And there are observations, and I think that the one is that excessively, obviously big organizations become more difficult, there are more moving parts, but organizations that are highly centralized, you get problems that are so pervasive in terms of decision making. You can kind of see it. I mean, I get astounded, and I don't want to be super critical here, when I sort of see the outcome of strategic deliberation that has been, there's massive investments gone into it and a massive time, and the conclusions are just like, how on earth did you come up with that? I mean, you can see big firms coming to the party 5-10 years later, and finally delivering a product 5 years after the party finished. And at that point, just about ready to go and follow something else. But what you get in those centralized organizations, often a pervasive influence. It could be a very, very strong leader. It could be doctrinal. It could be a belief. It could be anchoring to past successes. Okay? And I think we see this in organizations everywhere. And I think that the challenge is when you're looking at global organizations, but that by their very nature require a massive collective input. Just managing things is different. And the temptation, obviously, is to centralize stuff. But what I've observed in the corporate world is you've almost got the sine wave, because much like politicians, you can get leadership that's in for 5 years, then they're out. No one ever comes in and says, by the way, we've looked at what you're doing, and the last crowd got it absolutely right. Okay? So you come in and you observe that the organization is lumpy and bureaucratic and full of red tape. So you fragment it and you create specialist units, and they're out there and they're on top of the game. But then next crowd comes in and says, but look how inefficient this is. We've got duplication here, and we're doing the same thing in these two countries, and you re-centralize it. So I think that we do have challenges with finding the right balance between efficiency and effectiveness, the advantages of pooled resources putting in one place versus actually a far more tactical focus. Now, I think that this is evident in your big multilateral organizations and the United Nations. Also, the same things I was talking about previously as well, is that you've got a pervasive influence, and as it happens, it could be a doctrine. It could be, it might be that you and I embrace democracy and human rights and all sorts of things. But guess what? You can find that those are in conflict with other people's belief. And I don't think we've managed to create organizations that are truly reflective of the full diversity of views in the world. And so I sort of see that in much the same way as having like a dominant influence in a company, which is never really super, can work, kind of benevolent dictators work for a while, but it's very, very unstable.
Yeah.
So I do think that the attributes of organizations that work is that you have to be deliberately perceptive of the world, not just like kind of, hey guys, here's a great idea. There needs to be invention, because the problems are, if they were easy to solve, they'd probably been solved a long time ago. I do think that I have seen far more success in decentralized organizations than those that are highly centralized. Now, funny enough, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got branches scattered all over the place. It may even just reflect the decision-making culture of the organization. It may reflect the tolerance for difference of opinions. It may reflect the level of empowerment and delegation and how much accountability you put out there. So yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I'm fascinated by organizations, and I'm still actually fascinated by how long organizations can limp along for before they actually collapse. And I do think in a global perspective, where you've got big institutions with massive problems to deal with, the direction of travel must most surely be a higher degree of specialization, closer to the ground, understanding the more sort of idiosyncratic problems, and also just having connections. I think the risk of big centralized global organizations being completely disconnected with the societies they serve, I see that as a very, very big risk.
Sure. Oh. You've described challenges, right, at both at an individual and organizational level, which is quite interesting. Can you give examples of how these common roots can have or manifest in multiple, but also seemingly unrelated problems?
So I think there are lots of things. So if you want to go and even take something straight out of economics, so I'm interpreting your question as, if we go and take some of those individual character traits that where we sort of say that there are systematic biases and maybe gaps between if there's, again, systematic gaps between how we see things, there are going to be systematic errors in how we respond to them. Right, so good examples would be, how did we get into the mess we have in terms of, what we've done to the environment, how we've degraded the biosphere, the climate, is because we've failed to not only correctly account for the costs. So let's just go and look at, you're all over this, economic externalities. So we go and have cost of production, we work out the inputs into a process, we work out the cost of labor, et cetera, et cetera. That's how much it costs to, if we sell it, we make a profit. But what we're not fully accounting for is the cost we inflict on a broader society in the world in terms of pollution, how we dispose of things. But it's not only ignorance, because I think that we've been going for long enough right now that we are perfectly aware of the costs that we're inflicting. So why do we continue to do it?
Yeah.
And I think that you can incorporate a whole bunch of things there that include our sort of instant gratification and delayed costs. You have friends, you have people who are like, okay, if the whole thing is so messed up anyway, might as well make hay while the sun shines. And I think that kind of attitude is quite pervasive. But look, these things also come in terms of how we consume things, our consumption choices. They reflect in policies of municipalities and governments and the things that they emphasize.
Yeah.
Right? How do you allocate expenditure and resources? And ultimately, I think that our ability to quantify the abstract is a fundamental challenge for us. And there are various ways in which this sorts it out, but it's unclear that these things become easy to deal with until those risks become proximal.
Okay. I want us to close on looking at opportunities and threats in these common factors that we've been talking about the entire time. It seems like these underlying factors simply just exacerbate or multiply the problems that we currently are facing. And it does make one feel a bit gloomy and pessimistic, but I don't want us to conclude or end on that note. I'd like to ask you, are there any upside to these multiple global challenges being driven by these common factors, and if there's anything that you can tell me that can make me feel much more positive?
Okay, so can I take it back to investment? So if we look at like a common factor in a portfolio that you've got an excessive weight to. Now that could be that you're, without getting into too much of the vernacular, you have a value bias in the portfolio, quality bias, all of those things. Let's leave that. Let's just sort of say that the portfolio is highly exposed to a change in interest rates, for example. So you've got a whole bunch of stocks in there. You may have put those stocks in there deliberately because you looked at each single one of them. But what you weren't aware of was the inadvertent risk that you created, that there's a single factor, which could be an unexpected change in interest rates, that could have a synchronized effect on these things. So what a common factor does is create correlations, right? So in an investment portfolio, what we typically want are low correlations, because we want things going up when things are going down, and we want to capture outperformance with the least amount of risk. So what we're often doing is we are controlling for those factor risks. We almost want to neutralize them. We observe them and measure them to keep them under control. But there are instances where you might deliberately want to be exposed to it. So bonds, I know that you understand the financial maths, but just if you go and take something like government bonds, right, gilts in the UK, their prices fluctuate with changes in interest rates. Now, some bonds are more sensitive than others. So like long-term bonds are very sensitive to interest rate changes, short-term not so much. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Now, the answer is economists love is it depends, right? Well, if rates are going up, which is bad, then it's a very bad thing, okay, because you're losing a lot of money. However, that sensitivity or that risk is double-edged, because if rates are going down, your prices are going up. Now, the more sensitive or risky the instrument you're holding, the more it's going to go up by. So now if we look at the common factors that underlie global challenges, so long as those are producing a negative effect, that negative effect gets multiplied through multiple proximal challenges. But if you're able to produce a positive change, in other words, you reverse the direction of travel or you mitigate that, then you equally get a multiplier effect through that. So the positive way of looking at this is that if you can harness the multiplier effect of underlying factors, it's a very, very powerful tool. So instead of going and solving 500 individual challenges, if you can identify that there's this factor, that factor, and that factor that are common in some way, then it's a very profitable exercise to go and address those. Now, interestingly, we human beings are remarkable. And sometimes it looks like we're stagnating and going nowhere. But just think about when things take off. A new technology, a new craze, a new fashion. Let's not even talk about the fashion industry and what it's doing for the world. But we've seen how quickly, and it's for better or worse, because we also see populist politics take off and what have you. So these trends in our human world tend to actually form positive feedback loops and trends. Now, some things are multipliers and some things are exponents. But if you can capture the exponential effects of change, so I'll give you an example. Let's go back to investing. So we have, a massive craze, and some of it really is well founded, and some it's not. But you're going to take ESG in investing, so environmental, social governance. Now, there are many legitimate criticisms levied against it, like greenwashing, and it's not being taken seriously. You just go and create those portfolios, you find a new market. But actually think about what's more important, is that you've got this army of analysts, investment analysts across the globe, that are asking different questions. They're asking of management teams explanations for what their program is, how they're going to improve that, what is their policy on this. Shareholders are holding those management teams accountable. Consumers are holding those companies accountable on their programs. On top of that, you've got financial advisors who are now having conversations with end investors about ESG. Those conversations go to the table in the evenings. They had it at the school. And this is how those positive feedback loops are created. Now, positive feedback loops can be positive or negative, right?
Yeah.
Okay, normatively. But what you want is obviously virtuous circles. And I think that our ability to do that is very, very real. Now that has got quite a positive spin on it. I think that from a slightly more, maybe it's even perverse perspective, is that actually those abstract risks that are far away and intangible and whatever, as they become more real, we start moving into familiar territory as human beings. Okay, so much as we have massive tragedy with rampant wildfires, coastal flooding, extreme weather, heat waves that are breaking records, these things have an enormous human cost. But what they're also doing is they're triggering our primal senses, because it's happening to us, it's happening to our communities. It's the scope for skepticism starts shrinking. So I think that if one wanted to be positive, and I don't want to use the word optimistic, is that you hope that we essentially start perceiving risk more objectively, and unfortunately it might just be because these risk events happen. And secondly, that those conversations that we're having, those interventions, start producing feedback loops. There's absolutely no question. If you have a situation where you've got, you're battling to raise finance to go and create a new coal mine, yet there is abundant discounted opportunity to raise finance for green energy, and that's just one example. You're starting to create those feedback loops. So I think the big challenge, if it's almost at a conclusion point of view, is that it's timing. It's a race against time. The other challenge we've got is we don't really know what goes wrong here. So we know that the world is warming. We know we're losing species. We know we're losing habitat. We know all sorts of things. We know that human conflict, because bear in mind, we don't wait for things to happen. We don't wait till we don't get drowned by coastal flooding. We don't just carry on living in areas that are uninhabitable because of heat. It creates the pressures for human conflict and instability. So I think that the key thing is we've got to race against time. We currently have choices, but those windows of opportunity and choices shrink. So do I think we have the opportunity to avoid and mitigate a lot of what's ahead of us? Yes, I think we can. Do I think we're adaptable as a species? The evidence suggests that we have. We've been adapting for millions of years. But this could happen in a benign way and a very, very non-benign way, and the risks are very, very real. And yes, I know finance is a little petri dish, but right throughout the 3 years that I've been doing this course through Edinburgh, and on every occasion there's been some analogy said, but isn't that just like, or isn't that similar to, except that this is how it's different. Anyway, Bongs, just some observations. It's certainly not exhaustive, but it's really, really interesting topics.
Oh, interesting. I don't know if you have any closing statement, if that was it.
I think that's it, and just a great thank you to you for taking the time to have the chat with me.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brandon. That was very interesting.
Thanks, Bongs.
Thought-provoking as well.